Good evening, this is Open Book. My guest is journalist Jared Sullivan, whose first book, Valley So Low, One Lawyer's Fight for Justice in the Wake of America's Great Coal Catastrophe, tells the story of the collapse of the mountain of coal ash that resulted from TVA burning coal in their power plant outside Kingston, Tennessee, for more than 5 decades. Just before Christmas in 2008, the mountain collapsed, flooding the community with a torrent of coal sludge that engulfed the area. Jared Sullivan tells the story of the catastrophe through the eyes of some of the people whose lives were destroyed by the collapse, and the local lawyer, Jim Scott, who fought for the victims in a protracted lawsuit, a David and Goliath struggle between a small law firm from Knoxville and the gargantuan TVA. The story, as you tell it, begins 10 years after the event. The event in 2008, just before Christmas, a literal mountain. And, you know, when you call it coal ash, I think it immediately gives you the wrong impression of what we're talking about. It's more like coal sludge, right?
Yeah, so coal ash is, it's like, imagine if you had like a barbecue and you're burning charcoal, and afterwards, like that powdery stuff that's left over. That's like kind of what it resembles. But when that stuff gets wet, it's really this soupy, gross, just sludge. And a lot of this stuff in Kingston was wet. It was intentionally kept wet. So as you said, in December of 2008, this 6-story, 84-acre, I mean, it's like a mound of it, small mountain of it collapsed in the middle of the night. And yes, a lot of this was soupy, and it spread out over 300 acres. It kind of broke forth this soupy, wet stuff, kind of punched through this coal ash dike, this big mound. It was like water punching through a dam almost. You know, it was a really violent rupture, and knocked homes off their foundations, buried deer as it kind of swallowed the landscape. So it was a very, very dramatic scene. But this coal ash stuff was full of arsenic, full of radium, full of silica, just stuff you don't want anywhere near you.
When I was a teenager, there was a terrible disaster in Wales. A similar kind of mountain like that collapsed and came down and literally engulfed a village in Wales.
Oh, my goodness.
And there was a primary school, you know, children 7, 8, 9 years old, completely swallowed by this stuff.
Oh, my goodness.
It comes down like a toxic river. It's basically the same thing you're describing. And while it's a rural area, so it's not densely populated, there were a lot of people living there who were in the path of this river of toxic sludge. Is that an accurate description?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So Kingston, Tennessee, if you've ever driven between Nashville and Knoxville, you see the big 1,000-foot smokestacks as you're kind of coming into Knoxville. It's hard to miss, but otherwise Kingston, it's a fairly small town, just like a lot of other small towns in East Tennessee. And so fortunately, this big mountain of ash collapsed in the middle of the night. So people weren't out and about driving or walking around their houses. Most people were asleep, which I think saved lives. So no one died in the immediate aftermath of this big tidal wave of sludge covering the countryside, and thank goodness. But this sludge was still full of danger, and it proved to be dangerous for the cleanup workers. So after this dike collapsed, it was 2008. The economy was on its knees. The stock market and the housing market had just collapsed. Right, a lot of people were out of work. So after this big disaster, 900 men and women from across the country descend on Kingston to help clean this stuff up because they need jobs. And it's clear it's clear that TVA has a big mess on its hand, but for these workers, it's kind of a godsend as far as their employment goes. You know, they were really, really happy to get the call about this big disaster because they were truck drivers, they were equipment operators. They really needed to work, because all construction basically stopped in 2008 when the housing and stock market collapsed, right? There's nothing really going on. So these workers, in the first few years, you know, it's a lot of work. The problems really start to crop up about 2010 or so, once the sludge has had some time to be out in the heat, and it starts to dry, it starts to blow up into the air, and these workers start inhaling it. And that's really when their problems start. They start to have blackout in their trucks. They start coughing up blood. And that it just snowballs into heart failure, to cancer. And throughout the cleanup project, TVA and one of its chief contractors, Jacobs Engineering, they're like a safety firm, they tell these workers throughout the project, and the public too, that this coal ash poses no real substantial public health threat. There's one Jacobs staffer in particular who told the cleanup workers that they could eat a pound of fly ash a day and be fine, which is, in my view, an absurd statement, because there's tons of evidence and scientific studies about how this stuff is just full of toxins, stuff you just do not want anywhere near you, right? So these workers asked for dust masks, and in very few instances let me say that again. So these workers asked for dust masks and respirators and hazmat suits in some cases. And I found a transcript in my reporting where a TVA senior vice president told these workers, "Oh yeah, you'll have hazmat suits in 2 weeks. Don't worry about it." But that never really happened in any real meaningful way. There were a few isolated incidences where workers were given some protective gear, but it wasn't a site-wide thing. And that's really what should have happened. So in 2013, these workers are so sick they realize they need help, because they've asked for dust masks, they're not getting them. They don't want to quit because the economy in 2013 is still pretty slow, especially in that line of work for construction jobs. So they seek out this lawyer named Jim Scott who works in Knoxville. He's really like the narrative engine that moves the story forward. His quest to try to get some damages for these sick workers, some money so they can pay for their mounting medical bills. So the book ends up being kind of a legal drama. I do go into a great deal about these individual workers who are just blue collar folks from Knoxville and from around East Tennessee. But Jim, this my main character. He worked in a little strip mall office in Knoxville. He was not a high-powered attorney. He's kind of a mess. I kind of think of him as like a Huck Finn character. Like he's kind of like a good-hearted knucklehead, right? He means really well, but he's not perfect. He makes some mistakes along the way. He shows up to meetings with like wearing white dress socks with his suit, you know, and sends emails to opposing counsel like riddled with typos. He's kind of a mess. He's an eccentric little guy, but he has a lot of heart, and he believed these workers when no one else would. And over the next 10 years, he basically wrecked his life to push their case forward in court for some semblance of justice for them. So that's basically like the crux of my book, is following Jim Scott, this lawyer, as he's trying to do right by these workers and force TVA and Jacobs Engineering to do right by these workers.
And God bless Jim Scott.
Yeah.
I mean, this is a David and Goliath story, if ever there was one.
Yeah, exactly. And that's kind of...
I mean, that's what everybody told him, right? You must be joking. You can't go up against TVA. Aside from anything else, it transpires that TVA is shielded from most lawsuits. TVA is a weird kind of hybrid. On the one hand, it's a federal entity, but it's not funded by the feds. It was only funded by the feds. The TVA was established, as most people here know, by FDR in the 30s.
That's correct.
A response to what FDR saw when he came down to Warm Springs in Georgia. And he saw a beautiful part of the country where people were almost literally starving. And he wanted to do something about it. So he established the TVA, and it covers a huge area. And one of the first things they did was dam a river that I think it says in your book was almost completely wild. Nobody could do much with this river, the Tennessee River.
Oh yeah, you could hardly even drive a boat up it. I mean,
Right,
because
right.
Muscle Shoals down in Alabama, it was this huge rocky area, and you couldn't get really boats around that. So TVA did a great. I mean, TVA, its history is just incredible. It was born basically FDR looked at his predecessor Alfred Smith, who's now a famous historical figure in New York City history. He basically took these urban planning ideas from New York City that had been so successful in building highways and building public power, basically applied them to a whole region of the United States, the South. It's a 41,000 square mile region, right? It's Tennessee and parts of 7 other states. And as you said, yeah, FDR drove through this region on his way to Warm Springs, Georgia for polio treatment, and he saw people were living in shacks. The average income in 1933 in this region was 40% of the national average that the income was. So people here had nothing, and it worked out to the equivalent, when adjusted for inflation, about $6,000 in today's money. So people in 1933 were living on the equivalent of $6,000 a year. They had
Added
nothing.
to which, this is the beginning of the Great Depression.
This is in the middle, yeah,
So
exactly.
probably a lot of people weren't even making $6,000 a year.
Exactly. I mean, people were really, really hard up. So TVA was a miracle. They employed 40,000 something people to build up these dozens of hydroelectric dams all throughout East Tennessee and into Virginia, North Carolina, and so on. And it worked. The household income grew to within 60% of the national average within a decade or two, which is really, really a miracle. And again, it brought jobs. It also helped us win the war. The Oak Ridge is Oak Ridge. Oak Ridge is they built the bomb in Oak Ridge. They created Oak Ridge because of TVA's dams. There's 2 TVA dams within a short drive of that site, and that's why the Army built it. They needed a lot of power to build the dam. So TVA has been hugely instrumental in this country. It has done a lot of good for this region. The unfortunate thing is in the 50s, TVA basically had Eisenhower and some Republicans didn't want to keep giving TVA federal dollars. It was but TVA needed, partly because of Oak Ridge, the demand for electricity in the Cold War, they needed more power, so they needed more power plants. And they started getting into coal-fired power plants because those could produce a lot more electricity than hydroelectric dams. But Republicans in Congress just didn't want to pay for it, basically. So TVA they let TVA self-finance itself through the sale of bonds, which basically just means TVA is now, it's this weird hybrid where it's kind of the government still. The president picks its board. Congress approves its board. You can FOIA TVA for documents like I did to build this book, but it has the autonomy of a private enterprise, which worked really good when FDR kept a close eye on TVA when he was president. But really since then, a president has not focused carefully on TVA, and I believe it's in need of serious reform. And I am optimistic that with reform, it could be great again. I do not want to burn TVA to the ground. I think TVA, people may read this book and think that is actually just the opposite. I think TVA is as needed now almost as much as it was needed back when it was created.
Well, I think it's the quintessential example of a democratic approach to government, which is that when people are in trouble, government comes in with its resources and helps.
Sure.
Make life better for people. I learned at some point, I can't remember exactly when, the Tennessee River is the deepest river in the country. It's a huge river. And as you noted in your book, in 1867, the river flooded to where it was 58 feet above flood level. That's a 58-foot high wall of water hitting Chattanooga, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's amazing that the city's still here. It probably wasn't after that. It probably had to rebuild the whole thing again.
Yeah, I mean,
Because it must have washed almost everything away. I can't even imagine that.
that famous flood kill, I forget the exact number of bodies. I'm not sure if they actually ever knew exactly how many people killed. It killed a lot of people, but also think about what that does for your economy and your industry when your whole city is getting washed away every decade or so. It's really, really hard to have any sort of economy in that. So just controlling the dams was a huge, huge deal. We just had these huge floods, and without, I can't say this for a fact, but I suspect without TVA's dams, we would have, those floods, those rainwaters would have caused all sorts of havoc without TVA's flood control dams.
I can remember times, I don't remember which year it was in the last decade, when there was a huge amount of rainfall, and they were releasing water into the river from upstream,
Mm-hmm.
and the water was literally racing through downtown Chattanooga. If their dams hadn't been there, I can only imagine what it must be, because the power of water unhinged, unfettered, is just something to see. You know, it was probably moving at somewhere around 10 to 15 miles an hour, maybe faster. You couldn't put a boat on it. You know, it's just rushing down through the valley. This is Open Book. My guest is journalist Jared Sullivan, whose first book, Valley So Low, One Lawyer's Fight for Justice in the Wake of America's Great Coal Catastrophe, has just been published. The book tells the story of the collapse of the mountain of coal ash created by the TVA power plant located just outside Kingston, Tennessee, in 2008. What amounted to a small mountain of ash collapsed and engulfed the surrounding community. This is Jared reading from the opening pages of his book.
Basically the book opens, Ansel Clark gets a phone call in the middle of the night that says, you got to come to this, we need people, please come. So I'll read the part about the spill. So Ansel reaches the disaster site. There's this person named Tim Henry, his supervisor. So that's who this Henry character is. So at first light, Ansel and Henry climbed into a pickup and drove up the backside of a large wooded bluff that overlooked the coal ash mound. The sight at the top would stick in Ansel's mind until the day he died. Hours earlier, as the clock approached midnight, a stiff wind blew over the rolling countryside that surrounded the Kingston fossil plant. It was the winter solstice. In the quiet of that long night, the old farmhouses, country churches, trailer homes, and lakeside estates that dotted the hills and coves around the power station were dark and still. Christmas trees glowed in living rooms. The Year Without a Santa Claus played on TVs. Outside, the temperature hovered around 14 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to freeze the pipes at the McDonald's in town. Then, shortly before 1 o'clock, the north section of the coal ash dike suddenly and almost wholly collapsed. When it did, more than 1 billion gallons of coal ash slurry, about 1,500 times the volume of liquid that flows over Niagara Falls each second, broke forth. A black wave at least 50 feet high rushed northward with the power and violence of water punching through a dam. A backwater inlet separated the coal ash pond from a peninsula along the Emory River. A few dozen homes sat along the water's edge. As the black wave roared ahead, shaking the earth, it overwhelmed the inlet and slammed into the peninsula. Most of the slurry, nearly 6 million tons in all, forked right around the obstruction and rushed into the Emory River, filling in a 40-foot deep channel. The rest of the ash, nearly 3 million tons, filled in 2 sloughs on either side of the peninsula, hurling fish 40 feet onto the riverbank. The wave kept going. It downed trees, covered roads, and knocked out power lines. Docks were inundated, boats were carried away, soccer fields were smothered. The wave first collided into the home of 53-year-old James Sheen. With a thundering boom, it ripped Sheen's vinyl-sided place off its foundation, upturning furniture, crushing door frames, and knocking over Christmas trees. The rafters cracked.
TVA was a ministering angel. It was a godsend for this area.
Mm-hmm.
And then within a generation, within 25 years, it starts to become not so much a godsend anymore. In fact, they tend to turn a blind eye to a lot of things that weren't very good for this valley at all.
TVA made some very, very unfortunate missteps.
And according to your book, they knew about this from the 60s.
TVA in the 60s, they built these coal-fired power plants. But even in the 60s, it was clear that coal was not good for the environment, not good for people's health. That's been known for a long time. And, in the late 60s, early 70s, you started getting the Clean Air Act and stuff like that. So TVA is known for a long, long time it needs to get off coal. But the problem, and I think it's actually a great tragedy in TVA's history, at one point in the late 60s, it wanted to build 7 huge nuclear power plants throughout the Southeast. And that would have provided this region with a lot of no carbon emissions electricity, which would have been another blessing to this region. But TVA, when they started building these dams, first of all, they took way longer and were way more expensive than they anticipated. Second of all, they had some near catastrophes at some of their plants. In Browns Ferry, in particular, in North Alabama, an electrician was looking for an air leak or something with the match. I don't really totally understand the circumstances, but he ended up causing this huge fire at Browns Ferry, and the whole place started to go up in flames. And fortunately, it did not. The fire did not spread, and there was not a meltdown or anything like that. But it was a calamity. And that was a couple years before even 3 Mile Island. A lot of people today cite 3 Mile Island, the disaster there, as the reason why the U.S. nuclear program got put on ice. But TVA's nuclear program was already deeply troubled even before that. So they only built 3 of their 7 planned nuclear power plants, which to me is a great tragedy. Imagine if we had those 7 plants. Imagine if TVA had been able to build those safely and at a low cost. But they weren't able to. And now, how many decades later they're trying to restart their nuclear program again. But their nuclear program is still in my view, plagued with issues. They have whistleblower complaints against them all the time for workers allege that their bosses retaliate against them for raising safety concerns, and on and on and on, all these different issues. So we need TVA to be great again. When I say we, I mean Tennessee, but I also mean the United States. We need TVA to be great. They would be doing a huge service to all of us if they could figure out how to make abundant, low carbon, no carbon energy. So I'm rooting for TVA. I wrote a very, very critical book of TVA in hopes of maybe gently nudging them in the right direction and encourage them to live up to their peak, I guess, to recapture some of the FDR glory days. I want them to be innovative and dynamic again, just as they were in the 30s and 40s.
Well, when you start talking about TVA, you're talking about a behemoth. It's huge. Right?
It's huge.
So TVA, as such, can't be held liable for anything. It's the players within TVA and the enormous power that they wield. I think you said that the chairman of TVA was the highest paid federal employee in the country.
I'm almost certain that's still true to this day. I forget, Jeffrey Lias is the current CEO. He makes, I think it's upwards of $8 million a year or something like that. And TVA alleges that, to get top talent in that industry, that's what you have to pay. So they got exceptions from Congress to pay their top executives that, I think it's kind of bunk. But I don't. In my view, a couple of things should happen to TVA. I think TVA should be rolled in either to the Department of Energy, or the Department of the Interior, where there is greater oversight from a secretary level person, administrator. Because right now it really lacks the oversight that it used to have. Its board of directors. This is probably more wonky and than listeners may want to know, but the board of directors used to have a much greater control of TVA and help steer it in the right direction. But now the board of directors now is pretty weak and powerless, which is really, really unfortunate.
Well, judging from your narrative, the problems began when TVA had to be profit-driven, that they were no longer going to be funded by the federal government. But one of the revelations for me from your book was when you talk about, which everybody here talks about, Walter Cronkite famously saying that it's the dirtiest city in the country. As it turns out, from your book, Nashville and Knoxville were vying for that title too. And the reason for that, at least in large part, apparently, was all the particulate ash in the air. And people would say that you couldn't see, if you were on Lookout Mountain, you couldn't see the valley. Couldn't see the city in the valley because of all this stuff that's in the air. So it's almost like a fog, a miasma. And within that miasma, there's all these little black specks that coated people's clothes and got in their lungs and everything else too. And this was in the late 1960s. And then, the local folklore is that as a result of that and the Clean Air Act, they turned everything around. But it was TVA that was at the heart of that one too.
TVA was a huge, they're one of the largest carbon emitters in the country still to this day. They certainly were back then. And they didn't have really any emissions reduction things on their coal-fired power plant. So it was TVA, but other industry also contributed, no doubt. Tennessee, we had a lot more heavy industry back then. Right. So TVA was a large contributor. Was the sole factor? No, but it was definitely a big player. There's anecdotes in my book where TVA documents trees losing their leaves, dozens of miles from the nearest coal-fired power plant. And I talked to a man who, in his childhood, he lived near one of the plants, and he was hospitalized because all this smog and emissions pumped over his home from a nearby TVA power plant. He got to be rushed to the hospital. He almost died. I found this document where TVA people are talking about this 5-year-old boy. I went and found him 6 decades later, and he still recalled that incident, and corroborated it for me for my book. So
I want to make clear that this is a balanced portrait of TVA. You begin by talking about all the good things that TVA did, and then inevitably, because of this terrible disaster, you have to talk about all of the mistakes they made. And there's this sense that the people who were running TVA felt themselves caught between a rock and a hard place.
Well, let me say this. There's still a lot of good, honest, hardworking people at TVA. I don't want anyone to read this and think that, I think TVA is run by all these goblins or something like that. That's not the case. Some people at TVA spoke with me on background, meaning not for attribution, but they worked at the Kingston job site, and they said they did not. These were career TVA people who believed in TVA's mission, but they did not like what they saw happen at this Kingston cleanup site. So they talked to me because they believe in TVA's missions too, but they don't like some of the decisions TVA has made. I try to be fair and balanced. I did my best to show that TVA, yes, has done a lot of good, and there are a lot of good, hardworking people at TVA. But yes, I believe its leadership has made some horrible, horrible mistakes and has lied to the public repeatedly about the hazards of coal ash and about its emissions.
So you came to the story 10 years after the event. What brought you to the story? What made you curious about this, and why did you want to pursue it?
Well, that's a great question. So I grew up outside of Nashville, so I remember when the spill happened. I was a senior in high school. And once you see the helicopter footage from that day, it really sticks in your mind. It's really, really dynamic. I would encourage your listeners to search on YouTube, Kingston disaster. It'll come up immediately. I remember when it happened. So at the time in 2018, I was an editor. I went to UTC, worked a few magazine jobs, ended up in New York. I was at Field and Stream, then Men's Journal. So when I was at Men's Journal, there's not just tons and tons of Southerners, much less Tennesseans in New York City newsrooms. And my job as an editor was to basically be a story scout. Look for stories, have writers go write features about them. So I kept a careful eye, being one of the sole Southerners, Tennesseans in newsrooms I worked at, on the South, because I know the South is a story-rich environment. And I saw Jamie Satterfield, one of the best reporters TVA or Tennessee has ever produced. She wrote for the Knoxville News Sentinel. She ends up becoming a character in my book. She wrote these really compelling dispatches from the trial between the workers and this TVA contractor, Jacobs Engineering. I read the dispatches. I knew immediately what. Of course, I remember the Kingston disaster. So I flew down to Knoxville as soon as I could. I went to the ceremony commemorating the 10th anniversary of the spill. I met these great blue collar, hardworking people who, they got calls in many cases the morning of the disaster, and they showed up. I met these people, and they were sick from their time there. And some of these people I met at the ceremony ended up becoming key characters in my book. And kind of from that time on, I spent 5 years working on this book, and I had hundreds of interviews. I read thousands of pages of documents and court transcripts to kind of weave this narrative together. So that's kind of how I found the story. And I got laid off from my magazine job in 2020 when the pandemic swept New York City and then the United States, which of course was like not great at the time. I had a 6-month-old baby. But I decided to leave because of that. I decided to leave. Me and my wife decided to leave New York City and move back home to Tennessee. And I basically I didn't look for a job for a couple of years. I'm just going to report this out, and that's what I did. I just spent a ton of time on the phone, meeting with people. I met with people, and I spent a year just doing almost nothing but reporting. Then I spent the next few years typing up everything I kind of learned. So
it's a gargantuan task.
It overwhelmed me a little bit. I'm like in counseling for it now. That's not a joke. I really am. Me and my wife. It was a big sacrifice. But I mean, it's hard for me to really complain. I mean, I'm not the one who lived. I'm not a character in this book. I'm not someone who lived through this.
Well, you chose to focus on Jim Scott.
Mm-hmm.
So you have essentially a David and Goliath story.
Sure.
But Jim Scott sort of represents all of the Davids in the story, because there's lots of Davids in this story. All of these people, as you say, who were blue-collar workers, who didn't have a necessarily stable income, especially at that point in time, in the aftermath of the Second Great Depression, which is kind of ironic, really, when you think about it, that TVA was birthed as a response to the First Great Depression, and in the midst of the Second Great Depression, they become one of the reasons for the problem.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, Jim Scott, these... If you want to tell a book-length narrative, you need these worker stories are almost like so heartbreaking and so sad. I was like, they can't... I question whether they could sustain a whole book. It's just been too heavy. And Jim Scott was I think a dynamic, fun... I use fun loosely, but fun character that the reader could kind of root for. Because I think it's so bleak right now in the world and in U.S. politics. People need a hero, and I thought Jim would be a pretty good hero. Is he perfect? No. But I think his flaws, in my view, make him more likable, though. He wrecked his whole life. I mean, he wrecked his marriage for this case. He almost died. Spoiler, I guess. He almost dies at one point towards the end, partly as a result of this case. And I think he's an American hero in his own little way. So I hope readers enjoy meeting him and following him through this.
Well, it's Dickensian. That case I was telling you about that Dickens used as a focus for an entire novel was Jarndyce versus Jarndyce, which is a lawsuit that continues through generations. Kind of the kind of thing that apparently happened in Victorian England, and it's not the kind of thing that you would expect to happen in 21st century America. And yet this story is of these extended lawsuits. I mean, at what point was it? It was never really resolved, right? There were people still feeling that they didn't really get their due.
Even
at the end of all of it.
I don't want to give too much away, but the lawsuits are not ongoing now. They've stopped. It's really brutal how we make environmental regulations in this country. The EPA has been so undercut and so hamstrung by the courts that how we make environmental regulations is through lawsuits. So coal ash, people are burning less coal, and power companies produce less coal ash these days, mostly because of lawsuits against them. Because the EPA has been so weak in taking active steps to reduce pollution and emissions. And it's really a really, really brutal process. We expect these, in my case, in my book, these are blue-collar people who made $50,000 or $60,000 a year, and they had to wait a decade for any semblance of finality in these cases. And there's a lot of parallels between the story my book tells and the Exxon Valdez lawsuit, partly because the same defense lawyer litigated both cases. He litigated the Kingston case and also Exxon Valdez. There's a lot of parallels because after, as I'm sure your listeners know, this Exxon oil tanker spewed all these gallons into the Alaska fishery, wrecked these fishermen's livelihoods. They had to wait 10 or 15 years for any sort of money for Exxon having ruined their lives. And it is a brutal, brutal process. I like to think that we as Americans should be better than this. We should not subject people to these sort of decade-long legal battles when it's very, very clear in most cases what happened. The bad actors. It's very clear Exxon dumped a lot of oil into the ocean. It's very clear that TVA made a huge mess, spewed toxic waste all over a landscape. But the EPA has been so undercut. It's very, very unfortunate. So
in 1951, there was such bad fog in London because of the combination of damp. There's a lot of water in the air in London. It's an island. It's the air is pretty dense and it's humid a lot of the time.
Sure.
And they were using coal. Everybody was using coal to heat their homes. So all this coal is particulate is going into the air, fuses with the fogs which occurred anyway. Everybody knows the fogs from the Sherlock Holmes stories, and created smog, a toxic smog. It was killing people. It took several years after that when they finally said you can't burn coal anymore. And so then they started taking all of the carbon out of the coal and made coke. And that's what people used in their fireplace, what we used when I grew up, And it didn't produce any of that particulate. So when TVA started creating coal-fired plants, they knew already what was going to happen. The history is right there. Everybody knew, what happened in the UK and what a disaster it was. And to your point, it seems as if the people making the decisions at TVA were in a no-win position.
Because I mentioned they couldn't do the nuclear right, so they were kind of stuck with coal. They wanted to build more nuclear power plants, but they couldn't. So yes, the whole industry was kind of propped up by coal, and I should say after the Kingston disaster, they did slowly reduce their emissions, and now they've converted many of their coal-fired power plants to natural gas, which is about half the emissions, the carbon emissions as coal does. But that's still, I see it as it's a stopgap measure. It's not a permanent solution in my view of how to create electricity cleanly and abundantly. But one of the more talk about what TVA knew. One of the more interesting things I found in my research was a memo I found it in the U.S. National Archives. All of TVA's historical papers are in the U.S. National Archives in Atlanta. I found a memo in 1964. TVA's director of health sent this memo to TVA's director at the time, the head honcho at the time, and tells him that coal ash is blowing from the Paradise Steam Plant in Kentucky, kind of north of Nashville, and raining down on the cars of TVA employees, and it's eating away at the paint. It's also landing on people's vegetable gardens, and it's eating away at the vegetables. And the health director tells the top TVA guy that they ran tests, and there's proving that there's, quote, like definitive corrosive properties to this coal ash. And I don't know any material on Earth that could eat away at the paint of people's cars or eat at vegetables that would be safe for people to inhale or ingest in any sort of way. So TVA has had reason to believe since the 60s that this stuff is nasty, nasty stuff. But the federal regulations are so weak that with this coal ash stuff, they would just dig these big holes in the ground, these big pits, and just dump all their coal ash there. And over time, they grew into these pits. They grew into basically small mountains, and that's such as the one that collapsed in Kingston. And the Biden administration earlier this year finally cracked down on power companies and these big coal pits because many of them were unlined. So these coal ash pits, are 750 of them coast to coast in the United States, and almost all of them leak arsenic or something into the groundwater. And they contaminate, there's been studies done, they contaminate thousands of miles of American rivers each year and contaminate the drinking water of millions of Americans each year. And the Biden administration finally pushed back against the coal lobby and passed some rules this year that said power producers like TVA and others have to monitor their old coal ash dump sites, and if there is contamination, clean up the contamination and move the ash somewhere else. So I'm very curious to see if TVA has to dig up any of its old coal ash pits. They've dug up one outside of Nashville as a result of a lawsuit. They have not seen any announcement where they've said they're going to dig up their other coal ash pits as a result of the new EPA rules on coal ash disposal sites. I'm very, very curious to see what they do.
Well, one review, so TVA is in the wake of this river of toxic sludge that they've sent cascading all across the area around Kingston. They contract with a company called Jacobs Engineering to, quote, clean it up. One reviewer called them cartoonishly wicked, which it does seem. It's almost like, how could you even begin to try to justify this kind of behavior? Fess up, you've screwed up,
well,
move on.
Yeah.
But instead, they seem to take, they wanted to stonewall it from the beginning.
Yeah, let me just say something about Jacobs Engineering. First of all, they maintain, I should say, they did nothing wrong, and they dispute a lot of my reporting. So let me please include that, because they definitely don't think they did anything wrong. But they almost cannot admit that they did anything wrong.
But your book has been published, so evidently your publisher has fact-checked your book.
Yes. Well, we gave them a chance. I sent them a 20-something page memo, a fact-checking query saying, I'm going to say this, I'm going to say this, I'm going to say this. And they responded with their own 20-page memo to me, basically calling me an idiot, saying all my reporting is bunk. But I stand by my reporting. I think the record is very clear. My publisher, Knopf, stands by my reporting. So
has TVA taken you to court?
TVA
or Jacobs Engineering, either one?
No, I mean, I cite their notes and their feedback throughout this whole book. I mean, their viewpoint is well expressed. Their side of the story is well expressed. I quote their lawyers extensively in the book, so you can, the reader will know their point of view on what happens. You can hear their counter arguments to the workers' case. They basically the gist of it is that Jacobs alleged that there's just not enough coal ash in the air to make the workers sick, and even if there was, they allege that the workers cannot definitively prove that coal ash caused the workers their particular illnesses. Because their point is, one of their main points, like these workers in many cases, they also worked at Oak Ridge. They also worked at these other sites. So how can you know for sure that this coal ash caused them and not, say, contamination at Oak Ridge or whatever else? So that's kind of one of their main arguments. The readers can be the judge of how compelling they think their arguments are. But Jacobs Engineering, yeah, a TVA person told me on background that TVA hired Jacobs Engineering basically to diffuse responsibility. That's kind of the name of the game, to have a fall guy, and I think Jacobs was kind of a fall guy for TVA.
It strikes me that in many ways you and Jim Scott are in a similar position. You're both going up against a Goliath that could roll over you very easily.
I
that a
d-
concern for you when you started writing a book that is taking on a huge entity like TVA?
well, not to give too much away. A federal jury did rule against Jacobs, so there has. I'm not the only one to arrive at the conclusion that Jacobs and TVA failed the workers on the job site. So there's that. I also gave them opportunity to comment. I did my due diligence as a reporter, and I feel like their views are well reflected in the book. I also have a publisher, Knopf, which takes freedom of speech, freedom of the press very, very seriously. I mean, Knopf is one of the most storied publishing houses in the country. They have lawyers on staff. I also have my own liability. I took out my own insurance policy in case someone comes after me. But again, I don't think it's not going to come to that. I try to be fair to Jacobs and reflect their points, but also the record's pretty clear, in my view, about what should have been done at the job site, such as give the workers dust masks and respirators, and the record's pretty clear that that did not happen.
So Jacobs weren't really protective of the people who were working for them. TVA takes this. Well, it's not our fault. And so nobody wants to stand up, put their hand up, and say this is due to us.
Yeah. So
and the people
because the
who are
liability's
working for
endless.
them are caught between these pincers.
Because the liability's endless. Here's what I think needs to happen. In the late '90s, Bill Clinton and members of Congress passed a law that created a fund for Oak Ridge workers. And if you worked in Oak Ridge at one of the government bomb factories there, if you came down with one of 20 or so different cancers, you did not have to litigate against the Department of Energy or the U.S. government for your illness, right? They assumed, thanks to this law, if you had one of these cancers, that exposure to radioactive particles at Oak Ridge was the cause, and you would get compensated for it. They call them white cards. People who have these cancers, they get these, look like insurance cards, but on the front it says no copay, no deductible, and it's paid for by the federal government. The federal government picks up the tab for all their medical expenses. I believe that's what needs to happen with these Kingston workers, because they worked at a federal site.
This is Open Book. My guest is journalist Jared Sullivan, talking about his just published book, recounting the story of the collapse of the mountain of coal ash created by the TVA coal-fired power plant outside Kingston, Tennessee. The mountain that was created over 5 decades of burning coal at the plant finally collapsed in the winter of 2008, engulfing the surrounding community in a river of coal ash. Good story to tell. It's a very complicated story. What kept you going?
Money. No, don't use that. I don't know. What kept me going?
I mean, you spent 5 years interviewing people. How much time did you spend writing the book?
The whole book took me 5 years to produce. What kept me going was
The book from start to finish took you 5 years to complete.
it took me. This is my 6th year. I guess I'm done with it now. I'm talking to folks like you to promote it. It's been 5 years actually writing and reporting.
So that's a huge investment of your time and energy.
Yeah, I just felt like.
And what was it that sustained you? You have a young family, so you have other challenges in your life. What kept you going through this? And
It just
what
seems so important.
what do you hope will transpire as a result of your book?
Yeah, it just seemed like an important story to tell. I mean, this is it seemed like it really mattered. And it was about real people who, it's just a story as a writer you just want to tell, because the stakes were so high, the characters were so compelling. Like, how could you not sink your whole life in this? Especially once I learned about some of TVA and Jacob's shenanigans. It just makes your blood boil. It's like, we can do better than this as a people. We can do better this as a country and as Tennesseans. So that was a big motivating factor. One of my favorite little piece of writer advice, when William Faulkner won the Nobel Prize in the 50s, he used the opportunity to talk to young writers. And, 50s was the height of the Cold War. The threat of being blown up was hung over everyone. He tells young writers, he says, the basis, the core thing about life is to be afraid. And knowing that, the young writer must leave no room for fear in his workshop. He must banish fear from his workshop and only leave in his workshop room for the old verities and truths of the heart, pity and compassion and pride and sacrifice. And this story had all of those things. It had pity and pride and compassion and sacrifice. I mean, it's a story as a writer you just want to tell because it has it's just full of those old truths of the heart. People risking it all to try to do something good and noble and grand to benefit other people. So this story just swallowed me. But I'm glad I did it, and it felt worthwhile. And I hope it. I'm not an idealist. I don't think this is gonna. Is it gonna cause a big shakeup in TVA? I have no idea, but maybe it'll nudge them a little bit in the right direction and bring about some semblance of justice or something. So.
It's not a story that's been told up to this point, is it?
No, it's the first book about the Kingston disaster, and really the first major book about TVA in like decades, which is mind-boggling to me because it's such a huge organization, has done so much to shape our country, not just our South, but for the country. Talk about the war effort and the Great Depression and all that. So I feel very honored that people were willing to talk with me about it and were patient with me as I toiled away on it. I hope people enjoy it and get something out of it. So.
What you have done, as more than one reviewer has pointed out, is you take something that's dry as dust. We're talking about court transcripts and this sort of thing, and talking about the tortoise-like process of going through a court case, and you've made it into a human interest story by making the people who are some of the main actors three-dimensional. So I can't remember his name. Is it Ansel
Clark, yeah.
Ansel, I feel like I know Ansel from your book.
Yeah, he was a good man.
From your description of him.
He was a good, yeah. So my book, there's a lot of like characters, but Ansel and Janie Clark are the main workers I follow kind of most closely through this. They were blue collar folks from Knoxville. They met in high school. They didn't go to college, but they got good jobs and slowly built a nice little life for themselves. They built a nice brick home in the Knoxville suburbs. And were doing everything right. They weren't going to die rich, but they saved a little money but then the 2008 recession happened. Ansel was out of work. This disaster happens. He gets a call in the middle of the night that they need people down here to start moving this ash out of the way. And he steps up and responds. And then he meets a very unfortunate fate. And one of the most hardest things in reporting this book was I got so much material to help build this narrative. I got the 911 calls from when Janie calls Knoxville 911 dispatchers when Ansel is basically dying on the floor. And listening to that audio recording was still, when I think about it, still like gives me chills because it was horrific. She's on the phone with 911 dispatchers as Ansel's dying on the floor in front of her.
That's awful.
It was they were Ansel's a good man. I feel very
well. It seems for him, it just doesn't compute. I've been healthy all my life. All of a sudden, I've got this cold that I can't shake. He gets over the counter medication to correct it, and it's not working. But it's still, and I can absolutely relate. Most of us assume we're healthy. It always for most of us, I think it comes as a shock when you get sick.
Mm-hmm.
God, how did that happen? And in this instance, it's very much like that. He's a huge, strapping man who's spent his whole life doing manual labor, so he's a strong person. It's kind of like John Wayne being felled by cigarettes. One little cigarette, can fell this 6-foot mountain of a man. This, in some ways, it's that kind of situation where something he can't see and has sort of stealthily taken over his lungs.
Though I think the reader will sense in the book as you're reading about Jane Ansell, it's like, come on, of course it's the fly ash. But there was a lot of, I think, they did not want the workers were in a very hard position. I don't think they wanted to acknowledge how sick they were getting because they needed these jobs. They had wife and kids. There was not a lot of job opportunities for construction workers, for truck drivers at this time. So I think they managed the best they could until it just became undeniable that this fly ash was making them sick. Almost certainly was making them sick. But yeah, they tell Janie in particular at the beginning of the book, she tells herself over and over, surely it's the pollen in the air, the bad pollen counts this year. Surely this is something that he'll get over. And the reader knows all along, well, no, of course it's the fly ash. But they told themselves this over and over in hopes that you don't want to believe the worst, right? We never want to believe the worst. But the worst happened to these people.
This has been Open Book. I'm Richard Winham. Thanks so much for listening. My guest was Jared Sullivan. His first book, just published, is titled Valley So Low, One Lawyer's Fight for Justice in the Wake of America's Great Coal Catastrophe. Thanks so much for listening. Good night.